ITC. Where do I begin with ITC? For most people, if you ask them what they think of ITC right now, they'll probably give you one of two answers. They'll say they're not interested in the stock, or they'll say it's a meme stock, a joke. Nobody cares about it. The reality is ITC is much more than that. It's a giant, a Goliath, a company that does so many things, and yet it's been reduced to a joke. And I don't think that's fair. So in this video, I'll explain to you what ITC does, why it became a meme stock, how that transition happened, and ultimately even explain why things are changing. In 1910, the Imperial Tobacco Company would set up shop in India and sell cigarettes for the first time. For the next 6 decades, they would keep selling cigarettes, nothing else. And in the process, they would also change their name from the Imperial Tobacco Company to just ITC to show people that they weren't just a cigarette business anymore, but they were doing many more things: agribusiness, hotels, many other things on the side. The thing about ITC though is that despite being in existence for over 100 years, and having done so many other things on the side, it is still a cigarette business at its heart. At its core, it's still a cigarette manufacturer. So let me begin my analysis with the cigarette business. Now, technically, ITC isn't in the cigarettes business. They're in the legal cigarettes business. And there's a big difference. The cigarette business is open for everyone. Even I could set up shop tomorrow and sell cigarettes on the side. Unfortunately, it will be illegal. But the legal cigarette industry, that's a tough nut to crack. In fact, it's almost impossible for new players to enter the industry. Why? Well, because there's a ban on advertising. In the early millennium, the government of India would place a ban on tobacco and tobacco products. Now, in any other industry, in any other business domain, you would say that a ban on advertising would essentially end the entire domain. Like, how would you introduce new products to customers? It would be practically impossible, no? But in the tobacco business, things are a bit different. See, when you place a ban on advertising tobacco products, it hurts all the newcomers because there's no way they can market their products. But the existing players, they benefit from this. The existing smokers who are already used to brands, they'll keep smoking the same brands. They don't need new advertisements. But if anybody wanted to introduce a new brand, that would be practically impossible. So in essence, once the advertising ban took hold, the whole industry was blocked off for new entrants, and this only benefited ITC. They strengthened their position even further. And there's something else you need to know about cigarette manufacturing. See, if you want to set up shop and manufacture cars, you don't have to go and ask government for a special permit. But with tobacco, you need a permit. You need a license to manufacture cigarettes. And the government has been extremely reluctant to dole out new licenses. And as a consequence, ITC has a virtual monopoly in the cigarettes business. They control nearly 80% of the legal cigarette industry's market. That's insane. And considering there's also a ban on foreign direct investments, FDI, in cigarette manufacturing, it's unlikely that anybody can challenge ITC's dominance. And all of this is evident the moment you look at the company's financials and hone in on the segmental revenues, especially the segmental revenues from the cigarette business. During the financial year 2022, ITC's cigarette division generated revenues of close to 23,000 crores and segmental profits of nearly 15,000 crores. In fact, about 75% of ITC's entire operating profits came from cigarettes alone. This is why I called ITC a cigarette company at heart, even though they dabble with FMCG and agribusiness and infotech, etc. Because they are a cigarette business. And every year, they consistently generate massive profits from cigarettes alone. So there's that. Unfortunately, not everything is well in the cigarette business. The thing is, revenues from the cigarette division have actually been falling. If you look at the numbers from 2017, you'll see that the cigarette division posted revenues of close to 34,000 crores. That's 10,000 crores more than they did in FY22. So you have to ask, what's happening here? Well, the reality is people are smoking fewer legal cigarettes. And the distinction between legal cigarettes is once again very important because the government's taxation structure on legal cigarettes is very, very prohibitive. For instance, it's already taxed at 28% GST, but there's also a GST compensation cess added on top. Then there's something called as the NCCD. And put together, the government keeps increasing duties on cigarettes to a point where legal cigarettes simply become unaffordable for most people. So they simply switch to alternatives. Alternatives where the taxation structure isn't as bad. Meaning, for every 10 cigarettes sold in India, only one of them is actually a legal cigarette. And this explains why the volumes of cigarettes have been declining when it comes to ITC. It also explains why revenues are tanking. Fortunately for ITC though, there's one good thing about all of this. It's that despite the tanking revenues, their profit margins on cigarettes are actually going up. Now, why is this happening? Well, there's a different reason. ITC simply kept bumping up prices. That's it. In some cases, even though they cut the length of some cigarettes, they kept prices intact. So even though revenues were falling and volumes were probably not as robust as they were in earlier years, their margins were still intact. In fact, their profits kept increasing. Between FY 2017 and FY 22, profits went from nearly 12,000 crores to 14,800 crores. So they really were making as much money as they possibly could, even in an environment where demand for cigarettes wasn't as robust. In fact, the cigarettes business is such a big money spinner that the biggest problem for ITC is to just figure out what to do with all the money. What do you do with the excess cash? Well, I'll tell you what they did. In 2001, ITC would perhaps make one of its most ambitious moves ever. They would enter the FMCG segment, the fast-moving consumer goods segment. And it was ambitious because you already had players like HUL and P&G who had made considerable inroads in this segment. And ITC was coming with a bold promise. They wanted to be the biggest FMCG player in the country by the year 2030. Now that's ambitious. Unfortunately, they didn't exactly get off to a roaring start. Their first product line was ready-to-eat gourmet foods. Things like this packet of Mughlai paneer. The problem is that this was a great idea in theory because all you had to do was open the packet, put it in a pan, heat it, and eat it. That's it. Unfortunately, Indians weren't very used to this concept. So it didn't take off. But then the very next year, in 2002, they would launch a brand that I'm sure you know of. They would launch Ashirwad. In 2003, they would actually one up on them. They would launch Sunfeast biscuits. And soon enough, they would also launch Classmate notebooks. 3 iconic brands that almost everybody knows of today. And all of a sudden, they were onto something. In fact, they've grown so big that ITC today is the second biggest procurer of wheat in the country. Only after Food Corporation of India, the government. Classmates is the best-selling notebook in the country, and Sunfeast biscuit is the best-selling cream biscuits in the country. Put together with other brands like Savlon, for instance, and you're seeing an FMCG behemoth. In FY22, the FMCG segmental revenues topped 16,000 crores. 16,000 crores. It's so big that Britannia, for instance, a company that was born all the way back in the 19th century, 1890 or something, they had revenues only of 13,000 crores. I know it's not a fair comparison, but still, compare this to ITC that only has a track record of 20 years, and you'll see how far ITC has come in the FMCG game. Ideally, this should make investors very happy. Unfortunately, they're not all happy. See, the thing is, FMCG business has come a long way and it has a lot of potential. However, it takes a long time for this potential to turn into reality. I mean, the reason why you know Ashirwad and Sunfeast and Classmate is because ITC has invested boatloads of money and a lot of time just making sure that you remember these brands, just making sure that the quality is just right, just making sure that they have the supply chain in place to meet demand. Unfortunately, you can't do that in just 3 years. If ITC wants to have 10, 15 brands that can all contribute, say, 2,000, 3,000 crores to its portfolio, that's going to take time, and investors don't always have the patience to wait. Second, there's the issue with margins. In FY22, ITC posted EBITDA margins for the FMCG business that totaled up to about 9%. whereas HUL, a similar competitor, had EBITDA margins, earnings before interest, taxes and depreciation, that is, of close to 22-23%. That's a lot more than ITC, and this is to be expected because HUL today can price their products the way they see fit because people want to buy their products. For ITC to get there, they'll also have to invest time and educate consumers. They have to advertise more than perhaps an HUL or a Nestle, companies that have been in this space for a while. So the margins are always going to be worse than your traditional players that have been entrenched in the market for all these years. There's also the fact that the Ashirwad brand, for instance, contributes nearly 30% of the total FMCG sales. Unfortunately, Ashirwad is an atta brand, and there's not a lot of margins in atta. 80% of the input cost goes into acquiring the raw material, that is wheat. So there's not a lot of room for you to actually turn a profit. Finally, there's the fact that ITC still wants to build its own manufacturing facilities as opposed to contracting it out to other manufacturers. Obviously, this is because they care about quality of the products they sell to consumers. The downside is that they have to set aside a lot of capital to achieve this, which means that this isn't going to immediately become a massive profit center. The upside, however, is that their margins have been increasing. I told you, their EBITDA margins right now are at 9%. Just a few years ago, they weren't even turning a profitable margin. And that means there's a lot of potential here. The only caveat, the only thing that perhaps will worry investors a bit is that ITC, when it started off with the whole FMCG business, promised to become a 1 lakh brand by 2030. Right now, they're still at 16,000 crores. So to get there, they'll have to do something special. Will they do it? Well, we don't know. It's definitely a tall order. Now that we're through with the FMCG business, let's look at paperboard and packaging. Now, this makes sense, ITC dabbling in these businesses, because you need paper to roll cigarettes and packages to ship them. But ITC doesn't just tend to its own demand. It also supplies to other companies in multiple other domains, e-commerce, food services, etc. And together, this does contribute to a significant portion of the top line. Between 2016 and 2021, revenues increased from 5,300 to 5,700 crores. Modest, nothing extraordinary. Even profits increased somewhere from 910 crores to 1,100 crores. Once again, nothing exceptional. But the thing is, in 2022, something changed. Once people realized that the pandemic wasn't as much of a concern anymore, they wanted more of everything. They wanted to order more packaged food. They wanted to order more e-commerce items. They wanted to order more electronics. And so there was great demand coming in for ITC's paperboard and packaging division. In fact, revenues actually increased all the way up to 7,600 crores. Even profits went from 1,000 odd crores to 1,700 crores. And suddenly, paperboards and packaging division was the second highest profit generating division in the company. Now, I know that it still only contributes to a small section of the total profit pool, considering ITC Cigarette Business contributes nearly 75 to 80%, but it still amounts to something. The only problem, however, is that if inflation rears its ugly head and all of a sudden there isn't as much demand for e-commerce goods and packaged food, then the question is, will the margins suffer? And will the revenues actually go for a toss? Well, it's likely that will happen. However, for now, the paperboard and the packaging division is doing all right. But having said that, let's move to the next section, the agribusiness segment. Now, I know that most people don't think much of ITC's agribusiness segment, but the reality is that most people truly don't understand the scale at which they operate. The thing is, ITC's association with farmers goes all the way back to the early 1900s when they were setting up their first cigarette manufacturing facilities. And today, they have a presence that really surprises everyone. In fact, they are one of the biggest sourcers of agri-produce in the countries, and they source close to 4 million tons of produce every year from across 22 states. That's extraordinary scale. And once again, you would think that investors would be pleased about all of this, but there are issues. Take for instance segmental financials from the year FY 2022. During this year, the agribusiness division generated revenues of close to 16,100 crores. Now, this contributes about 26% of the total revenue. That's not bad. Unfortunately, earnings before interest and taxes only add up to around 1,000 crores when you compare this division to other divisions in the company. Now, this is problematic, especially when you consider how agri-commodities work. A bad monsoon affects crop quality. A poor crop quality means that ITC has to pay a higher price to procure raw materials. Their input costs rise, and suddenly the wafer-thin margins, we're talking about 6%, they disappear overnight. And then there's another problem. About 20 to 25% of the segment's external turnover comes from leaf tobacco. And leaf tobacco, I told you, cigarette volumes are actually dipping, which means demand for leaf tobacco isn't as robust as it used to be. Put together, this could put the entire segment in jeopardy. Fortunately for ITC, they recognize that this is a problem. So they're now diversifying into value-added products, higher margin products, things like frozen marine products and processed fruit. So you could argue that while not everything is great about agribusiness, there's still a lot of optimism. Unfortunately, this optimism doesn't flow into the hotels business. Now, I know most people think that hotels is a glamorous business, it's a luxurious enterprise, and that it's a money spinner. Unfortunately, I have some disappointing news for you. It's not. It's a capital-intensive business. Just to put together one property, you'll probably have to spend millions of dollars, invest close to 3 to 5 years just in building everything, and then spend loads of money in just maintaining it, security, taxes, electricity, etc. And then hopefully you can make money. It's also a highly seasonal business. Some months hotels go occupied completely, other months not so much. And so you have to manage these trends carefully, which means that for ITC, the hotels business has persistently been a drag on their bottom line. And it's not even a big contributor to their top line. In FY22, the segment reported revenues of close to 1,300 crores. That's barely 2% of the company's total top line. And profits, well, in 2021 and 2022, it didn't even report a profit. It made a loss. And it's understandable because these were pandemic years. But even if you were to ignore this anomaly and look at the best years, you'll see that the bottom line has barely managed to cross the threshold of 200 crores. It just doesn't make a dent on the top line, neither does it make a dent on the bottom line. In fact, if there's one criticism that most investors have had about ITC, it's that the hotels business is a capital guzzler. It takes in capital and the money just disappears. In fact, if you calculate the return on capital employed for the hotels business in the past few years, you'll see that it averages around 2%. Now, the thing about that is, you could argue that ITC is better off simply setting aside this capital in a fixed deposit. They'd probably make a better return on investment there. So, in many ways, the hotels business is viewed as a disappointment by the large investor community that believes in ITC. Luckily, the final business that we're going to talk about, ITC Infotech, isn't half as bad. In the financial year 2022, the segment reported revenues of about 2,200 crores and profits about 510 crores. Now, I know that this also doesn't make a massive impact on ITC's top and bottom line, but the reality is, it isn't a capital guzzler like the hotels business, so investors don't mind it. In fact, ITC has been talking about hiving off the Infotech business and probably listing it as a separate entity, the same way L&T did with its Infotech business. Is it going to happen? I don't know. But if it does happen, maybe there's some value for ITC investors there as well. And if you were to put all of these businesses together, you'll see that ITC as a company has posted revenues of close to 60,000 crores and profits of nearly 15,000 crores for the financial year 2022. Now, I don't know about you, but if some company is posting that kind of numbers, I wouldn't call it a meme stock. I wouldn't make a joke out of it. How on earth did ITC actually become a meme stock? Is it because they failed in the edible oils, apparels, and financial services business? Or is there something else? Well, the truth is, there is something else. In fact, there's actually many reasons. ITC is predominantly a cigarette company in a world that just doesn't want to do anything with cigarettes. Smoking kills. Nearly 1.35 million Indians die due to chronic diseases related to tobacco consumption. And that's just the human impact. The ecological impacts are even worse. Tobacco plantations alone may have caused global deforestation of up to 2 to 4%. That's what some estimates suggest. My point is that ITC is a sin stock, a product that regulators want to clamp down on. And I know some of you will look at this and say, well, what about companies like Coke and Burger King? They cause diabetes. They have similar debilitating impact on human life. Why doesn't anybody talk about that? Well, I wish more people talk about that, but unfortunately, that's just how investors view these things. Take, for instance, ESG funds. These funds use environmental, social, and governance criteria to decide where to park their money. And if there's one stock they're all staying away from, it's ITC. In fact, foreign shareholders are even more conscious. Between 2015 and 2021, foreign shareholding in ITC has gone down from 20% to 10%. They don't want to do anything with this stock either, which means a lot of owners who buying ITC has fell on domestic investors, and even they are wary. And this becomes even more complicated when you realize that ITC isn't some upstart with bags of potential. Instead, it's a mishmash of businesses with its own benefits, but also some very major complications. For instance, the cigarette business makes a lot of money, but then there's the sin product label attached to it. The FMCG business has lots of potential, but we talked about how margins are still improving and it's a work in progress. And then there's the hotel business that's simply a drag on the bottom line and it's sucking value out of ITC. And investors don't like this kind of thing. In fact, if there's one demand that they've persistently made about ITC, is that they've requested the management to demerge these businesses, separate them and list them as independent entities. This way, you will know what each business is worth without any confusion. In fact, you can hive off the FMCG business and investors can value it just like other FMCG businesses without the tainting of the sin product label. You can remove the hotels business and see how management can deal with all of the issues without the handouts from the cigarettes business. And the cigarettes business can keep doing what it always has been doing, just generate profits and eke out those dividends back to investors. This way, all the confusion could be sorted and you could extract as much value out of ITC for every investor involved. Unfortunately, that demerger hasn't happened. In fact, it's very funny because you can find mentions of demergers going all the way back to 2009. Since then, every time investors hear the word demerger, they've gotten excited and it's always a few years away. Back in 2009, the then chairman of ITC, Mr. Yogesh Deveshwar, commenting on demerger said, all options are on the table. And in 2022, almost 13 years later, the current chairman of ITC says the same thing. All options are on the table. So the question is, will this ever happen? And if it's not happening, why isn't it happening? Well, it's likely because ITC's management team has little incentive to do a demerger. In fact, you should understand something about ITC. It's not like other companies. It's run by a professional management team without active promoter intervention. What does that mean? Well, look at the shareholding structure of ITC. About 30% of the company belongs to British American Tobacco. A similar stake is held by the Government of India through SOOTI and other life insurance companies. And retail investors hold about 10% of the company. So in reality, there's no one entity driving the company's vision. And that means everything is dependent on the management. Yes, they're answerable to the board, but ultimately they will drive the company forward the way they see fit. And it seems right now, if they were to demerge other businesses like FMCG and hotels, then they lose access to the cash cow, the cigarettes business. If they had to run the hotels business independently, then do you think ITC will remain zero debt as it is today? It's almost inconceivable. The hotels business will likely take on a lot of debt and it will be extremely hard to run the business consistently generating profits and revenues the same way investors expect it to. And it's the same case with FMCG business. They'll have to invest in factories, keep increasing margins without taking on debt, unless they can always depend on the cigarettes business. So where is the incentive for managers to then separate these businesses and list them independently? Because right now it's very easy to simply cross-subsidize everything. If something doesn't work in the hotels business, more money from the cigarettes business. If something doesn't work in the FMCG business, do the same thing again with the cigarette business. So in reality, the reason why management team at ITC hasn't committed to a demerger despite talking about it for over 10 years is likely because they have nothing to gain from it. And if that is the case, you have to ask yourself, will the demerger happen now? Will it happen in the next 5 years? And should investors be excited about this? And that leaves us with one final problem: the massive dividends. See, between 2003 and 2009, ITC gave back close to 30 to 40% of their profits to investors by way of dividends. This was a good number. But in financial year 2022, they gave back nearly 93% of their profits back to investors by way of dividends, almost the entirety of their profit pool. And I know some of you will be ecstatic hearing this number, but it also means that ITC is making a confession of sorts here. They're basically saying we don't know what to do with the money. We don't know what to do with these excess cash flows. And so the best thing that we can think of, the absolute best thing that we can think of, is return this money back to investors. And in all honesty, that's not what investors want to hear. They want to hear things about growth, about better return on capital. Giving back money to investors, that's a bit of a bummer. And I think it must be obvious to everyone who's watching this video by now that despite all the promises that ITC held, despite the potential from the FMCG business and the cash cow that is the cigarette business, the stock wasn't going to go anywhere. In fact, between 2017 and early 2022, the stock price dipped in value. ITC shareholders lost money, if you exclude dividends, that is. And this was happening at a time when the broader market outside was doubling in value. Everybody was making money except ITC investors, except investors who believed in this century-old company. And you can see how even the most hardened fans of ITC would feel betrayed by this. You can see how ITC had finally become a meme stock, a joke that nobody wants to pay attention to. But then something extraordinary happens. All of a sudden, ITC starts going up. The stock starts gaining value. At first, it hits the rupees 300 mark, a mark that many consider a milestone. And then it makes an all-time high. Soon, before you know it, it's already beating the broader index, that is Nifty. And everybody's wondering, what's happening with ITC? How is it suddenly gaining value? Well, to understand this, you have to understand how the dynamics around ITC and the market in general has changed in the last 2 years. In fact, there's a bunch of reasons. The first thing that you have to know is that there's a complete change in perception now about markets, about stocks, and about the economy in general. All of a sudden, there's talks of an impending recession, growth expectations are muted, and inflation is once again rearing its ugly head. And at this point of time, investors don't exactly want growth. They want something to insulate their portfolio from the shocks that are incoming. Now, what stocks come to mind that are specifically recession-proof? Well, one stock that I can definitely recommend is probably ITC. ITC is extremely recession-proof. I mean, look at the profit center that is the cigarettes business. Demand for cigarettes will always largely remain inelastic. That is, even if there's a recession, especially if there's a recession, smokers will still want to take the edge off and they'll buy their favorite cigarettes. There's no doubt about that. Then there's the FMCG business. Again, something considered to be largely recession-proof. And finally, you know for sure that ITC will return a large chunk of their profits back to investors by way of dividends. So if you have a dividend yield of about 4 to 5%, you're still beating inflation. And so it's all of a sudden a nice stock to have on your portfolio, which explains why most people now want to pay a higher PE multiple for the stock, because they just view ITC differently. It's a defensive stock. Second, there's the taxation structure. Now, I know I said that the government has been extremely proactive when it comes to taxing cigarettes, but the reality is, since 2022, that attitude has changed slightly. The taxation regime has largely remained stable. In fact, they're even going after illegal cigarettes, and as a consequence, people are forced to buy legal cigarettes. And so the volumes for ITC have been increasing in the past few quarters. In fact, in the quarter ending December 2022, ITC's cigarette volume increased by about 15% when compared to the same quarter last year. So there's definitely a lot of renewed optimism. Then there's the hotels business. Now, I don't know about you, but have you ever tried booking a hotel in the recent past? If you have, you know what I mean. Most hotels have already gone booked, and if you want to book something, you have to pay a premium. And ITC is also benefiting from this renewed demand coming from people who are tired of staying at home since the pandemic. And suddenly, a business that has been a drag on the bottom line is also turning profitable. In fact, it's actually driving ITC's profitable, albeit at a small scale. And you realize that this is a purple patch like no other. The thing is, even foreign shareholders are getting back in on the act. Between December 2021 and 2022, foreign shareholding in ITC has gone up from 10% to 14%. I mean, even foreigners are interested in ITC. So really, the only question left to ask is, where is ITC headed now? Will this purple patch continue? Well, truth be told, I have absolutely no idea where ITC is headed. The reality is, if I knew where ITC was headed, I wouldn't be making this video, no? I would probably be betting on ITC and making money there. And my objective with this channel and this video isn't to predict the future. Instead, it's to hopefully give you a sense of what ITC is as a business and as a stock. Present the facts, give you my opinion, and lay a foundation so that you can think for yourself, so that you can decide where ITC is headed. Yeah, that's it from me. Hopefully you will like, subscribe to this channel, and also comment what you think about these long form explainers. Do you want me to talk about other stocks and industries the same way I did about ITC? And if yes, please express your comments below. And if you have any feedback also, I'll be reading everything, and these comments help me improve and help me do better in my future videos. So yeah, thank you. And hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye.